Greetings. Welcome to the Lava Garden Show, June 10th. Well, yesterday, bounding around the place, I bunged my right ankle up. And so, I'm not doing any trucking around today. No orchids, no pictures of fruit. I'm going to sit right here and talk. So, welcome back. As far as the volcano is concerned, last night, again, Haley Mao went ahead and did another rock and ash discharge up there. 5.2 earthquake was created in the concussion. Here at the house, most of this stuff, if I feel it at all, is just sort of like, oh, was there a thump? You know, it's very, very subtle. We haven't had any really good earthquakes around here since the first few days of the activity. We were feeling them. Since then, stuff's really localized up to the caldera. I guess it's been pretty bad up there. The museum that overlooked the calderas, it's got the observation deck has been cracked. That was a concrete and stone affair. Everybody piled onto, so many tourists every day. Well, I guess it cracked with the earthquakes, so well, that's not good. This is the longest time that the national park has been closed in its history, with the exception of martial law during World War II. It's pretty special, and I, for one, am still worrying that my park won't ever reopen, but, you know, oh, ye of little faith, right? Hopefully we'll come back, even if it ends up coming back down in Leilani Estates right on top of my buddy Jim's house. It'll open back up, I hope, soon. Otherwise, the fissures down in Leilani, fissure number 8, it was reading up to about 250 feet high in the showers that were coming up out of it. Just a few days ago, this morning, I heard that it was down to 150 feet, the ejection of magma coming out. This could just be temporary, who knows, but it does imply, at least it's possible, that the pressure behind all this is reducing a little bit. Hopefully it will eventually reduce completely and stop, but the cone that it's producing down there is getting higher and higher, and so it's looking more and more like a little volcano to itself every day. There is the distinct possibility that it could become the new active vent in the rift. I had a message this morning from a nice lady who was enjoying the show, and her father has a papaya farm down in Kapoho off Papaya Farm Road. He has lived there since 1971, and as of her writing, the lava was only 4/10 of a mile away from the farm. It's really sad. Let's all hope that her family are going to be fine. It does seem, though, that Lava Zone 1 was much better if it had been intended as an agricultural location than as housing developments. You know, because we're at least 600 homes lost so far because of this. Now, if the entire area had been zoned totally for raising papayas and nursery stock or something else, there would still be losses, there would still be people suffering, and there'd be economic impacts, but it wouldn't be as great as what we're seeing today. So let's hope that for the future, that settlement and usage for houses of that particular area of this state will be no longer, and that it will mostly be farms, forests, and birds and trees, much higher usage. But yesterday, in memorial to all of the papayas that perished down in Kapoho in the flows, I was out in my own garden and I was planting papayas. It's tongue-in-cheek as far as a memorial. Mostly I'm sitting around thinking, yeah, these are going to be great with my breakfast, but Yeah, so as I was out there, I was, working with the soil and digging holes, listening to the birds and yelling at the frogs and the roosters and whatnot. And what we see is cycles in nature. How everything in nature recycles itself, perpetuates itself. Um, these thoughts come to my mind when I'm out in the garden all the time. I imagine that many other gardeners out there in the world see these same things. How you take a plant, it makes a seed, the seed then perpetuates the plant, and perfectly too. Amazing how well that works. Um, I think a seed is one of the coolest machines we have. It's a biological mechanism, but really does a better job than a Ford. It doesn't even need a factory. Um, and how, the humans, we eat the papayas. Papayas become Bill. I am made of what I eat. You are what you eat, and I'm a composite of all sorts of different things that I consume. And so papayas from a seed grow up to be a plant, which then in turn are eaten by people and animals. The papayas then become the people, essentially. They're converted. The energy is used in a different way. The trash from the papayas, the peelings that we put in the compost, or the dead leaves that fall down, or the dead plant itself when it collapses, they recycle into the soil, becoming food for microbes and food for fungi, and then of course the nutrients that are contained in them are re-releasing back into the earth, being reabsorbed by something else again, and so when we look at our natural world, it's pretty easy to see that we have these constant cycles of procreation, constant recycling, that everything is turning into everything else. And I like to, as a person, take these kind of micro local concepts that we see right out there in the garden, and I expand them into the entire universe, because the guy who has few beliefs does believe this, and that is that what you see in front of your face is most likely pretty much the same as the big picture, that things are just large and small, and that whatever we see here on Earth probably occurs in some way or another in other places. See? And obviously, here on the island, the volcanoes will erupt, they will destroy the landscape, but given time, that landscape then becomes more island, grows more forest, becomes more beautiful paradise, and so on. So the death and destruction is combined with the creation, regeneration, and growth. They can't be separated. So, looking out there into the rest of the universe from the garden, and seeing that these stars, when they explode, create the higher elements that, make our bodies, make the ring on our finger, make all this different stuff. It's all created out of destruction and then becomes creation again. So, as I was planting the memorial papayas in honor of the perished papayas of Kapoho, it came to mind that if stuff that happens in the garden is in cycles and recycles, and what I see out in the universe outside, our Earth here, it seems rather similar in the way it functions, that I don't see a lot of difference between volcanic eruptions creating Hawaii and stars going supernova, creating new solar systems and dust and so on. This all, to me, fits together in one big picture. All operates kind of the same. So then I began to wonder, yesterday I had mentioned about the high suicide rate and some of the celebrities, very talented people that have perished recently because of this. And of course, I am not qualified to speak on that subject. There are a lot of people that know a lot about it. I don't. I'm a garden guy. All right, that's it. But it does trouble me what I see, because I love living. I'm fascinated by this existence. I think that it's a very special thing, and it's an opportunity that we have while we're here. And sometimes way we feel, the way we think, and what happens to us can cloud that, so we don't see just how grand and amazing it really is, and we lose track of our fascinations and passions in life. And well, we want to get out of here early. I kind of wonder about that, because if the papaya makes a seed that then becomes Bill, you know, as a fruit, and then recycles as waste and nutrients into the soil to become more plants and all that, and if that's the way it works there, then I don't know if humans should be any different. That, in other words, as we end our existence here, is there a proper recycle? Now, I'm sure everybody's got opinions on that one, and I'm sure I'm going to hear them too. But, you know, as a person, me, I could say that I have been swayed in how I feel about this due to my early education in life, having spent 8 years in a Lutheran school. You know, they taught us about life, death, heaven, hell, the soul, and so on, salvation and whatnot. And so as a young man, I grew up with these concepts that life doesn't necessarily end at the tombstone. And if that's the case, then it seems that how that all transpires is quite important. I've had a lot of other thoughts since, you know, and rejected many of the views that I had been taught as a young man, because I thought I found other viewpoints that were more logical to me. But for sure, I can't let go of the idea that there's something important about life, and then in that case there's probably something just as important about death. No one ever comes back, you know. Well, I mean, we do have one story in our culture about resurrection, but past that one single story, we really don't have any really good information, because nobody sends postcards back from the void, you know. It's like when Uncle Harry passed away, I didn't get any mail from him that says, hey, things are great here in the afterlife, you know. That doesn't happen. And so it is the great mystery, you know. What happens as we pass out of here is a real mystery. And personally, I believe, because I believe in me, that people who think they know what happens, that's very questionable. Like I said, because they don't come back. They don't send cards. And so it's only a guess. It's conjecture. So much of the evidence that each and every one of us may have personally to believe that there is a soul, that there is an afterlife, this evidence is personal, very subjective to that individual experience, and it's not really transferable, because I could sit here in front of the camera and I could talk all day long about the reasons why Bill believes we have a soul, okay, because I do, but it wouldn't do you any good, you know, because it's very personal for Bill, and it's not information that's going to convince you in any way. Anybody who has these sorts of beliefs usually will have them as personal experiences that are non-transferable to other people. There's good stories. That's about it. And you know, I can tell you, you know, briefly that, for instance, my misfortune, I guess, of having lived in several very haunted houses, has led me to believe not only that there is a spiritual or non-corporeal aspect to human beings that remains after the body's gone, but also in hauntings, I believe that it can go wrong. This is my greatest fear. Actually, if I have a fear when it comes to death, it's simply that I have seen what I think is death going wrong. I don't believe ghost is a good place for most of us to be, at least, and I don't think it's how most of us actually end up. But it does happen. You know, in one of my houses, the ghost would arrive usually during big gatherings, parties. Show up, party with us. And I mean, I often watched partygoers who weren't aware of the fact that our house was haunted literally run out in a streak and have to change their underwear, scared to death over what they saw, because most of us really don't believe in ghosts. Now, I would be interested, actually, in hearing back from many people who have had ghost experiences, because I think that there are probably more of us out there than most people are willing to admit, because this stuff's kind of considered superstition and hooey. But when you live through it yourself, it changes things. It's a mind-expanding experience, and there's just no way around it. You're never the same. I was never the same afterwards. I definitely changed how I felt. Although I don't see ghosts as afterlife per se, or desirable afterlife. I believe it's an afterlife gone wrong. It's probably being trapped, where we should have gone one place, we ended up in another for whatever reason. And the other seems difficult to get out of. Ghosts persist and last for long, long periods of time. A very good friend of mine, Dale, I won't mention his last name, but Dale, he was a college philosophy professor. This is a very unusual job. You know, any of you out there, you auto workers, insurance salesmen, a philosophy professor? Yeah, that's what he was on college level. And he was a bachelor and a very poor cook. And well, I always had plenty of food around my house, and I like to cook. And so I used to invite him over all the time after meeting him, just to eat, you know, sit around, we'd eat. He enjoyed the heck out of it. I do a few other different things too, sometimes go fishing together or whatever, but we became really close, and one of the things I really loved about our relationship was that, having been a very highly educated man in the history of philosophy, I enjoy philosophy as an amateur, okay, no pro here, but they tell me I am somewhat philosophical on my viewpoints on life. Well, I sit around with Dale, and depending if it was early in the day over a pot of coffee, late in the day over beer, you know, and records and such, we'd hang around and crash into the sofas, and I just started talking about ideas that I had, and well, Dale would oftentimes come forward and go, "Oh yes, that was St. Thomas Aquinas," and quote the line in the year, you know, and I go, "Really?" He said, "Oh yeah," or it would be, "That was Socrates, he said this," you know, and I go, "Dale, you mean I actually had a similar thought to what Socrates had?" He says, "Oh yeah." He says, "It's not unusual. These ideas kind of float around in the culture, you know, and they come up in different ways." So, okay, yeah, because I never saw myself as being a great philosopher or thinker. So it comforted me, though, to know that I was having thoughts about life and reality that were similar to some of the great thinkers, you know. I always love that. Substantiates the fact that I'm on track and I'm not being, you know, illusionary, and not, there's validity to my thoughts. And anyway, so this was an ongoing thing, and the discussions we had would almost always, in the end, you know, by midnight would move towards, well, you know, is there life after death? Do humans have a spirit? I mean, this is obviously a major part of a lot of philosophy and religion, you know. So it had its place in there, and it would always come to it. And Dale, being a very scientific-minded character and very logical, he refused to acknowledge that idea because it couldn't be proven. No way to substantiate it scientifically. And of course, he was right. And I realized that, you know, if I have faith, faith for me is just that there are some things that I would prefer to believe one way rather than believing in them another. You know, for instance, I believe that the universe has intelligence behind it. I also believe it loves to laugh at itself, and it wants to be as much as everything as it possibly can. As Terence McKenna once put it, that it expresses infinite novelty. I like that one. And I believe that. Why do I believe it? Because the alternative is ugly, is kind of gray, and not very attractive, that everything happened by random chance. It was just one thing bumped into another, and there we had a reaction. Well, yeah, I can believe that too. But I don't like that story. Yeah, I prefer the one that the universe actually loves itself and wants to be. I also believe that human beings had a spirit. Probably had a little more evidence to that than I did that the universe smiles. But that was always where it would end. Dale and I would agree to disagree. Bill can believe there's a spirit. Dale says there's no proof. It's cool. We were good friends. We knew how to discuss and argue and debate without getting angry at each other, so we just opened another beer, put on the Eric Clapton record, and lay back and move on. Well, Dale had a strange habit, I guess you could call it somewhat compulsive sort of behavior, and that when he was grading papers, I would often show up at his house in the afternoon on the weekend when he was working with all the papers that he had to have graded for Monday morning. Well, he would have a stack of papers here undone, perfect. Another stack here done, one in front of him that he was looking at. The pencil was lined up perfectly next to the piece of paper. His pack of Marlboros was sitting exactly squared. If he had a cup of coffee, it was sitting here, you know, and it was always the same pattern. There was never any variation. Nothing was ever out of alignment, you know. Well, being a guy who kind of wiggles and dances, and I don't really like straight lines all that much, you know, that every time Dale would turn his head to move a paper, I would reach over and I would turn his pencil 2 degrees from straight. He'd turn back, he'd see it, he'd know immediately what had happened, and he would grunt and move it back straight. He would never say a thing, though. Never. You know, I'd do the same thing to his pack of cigarettes. He'd turn his head, I'd roll the Marlboros, canting them just a degree off. He would immediately see that the Marlboros were off and straighten them. Grunt, move on, you know. This was kind of a somewhat sadistic thing that I played with him for years. Every time I noticed this obsessive kind of compulsive thing he had about organization, I would always jump in as Bill the Demon, and I'd screw something up. I don't know, yeah, a little sadistic maybe, but it was, you know, it was a friendly thing. Really, it was. At least I thought it was. I was teasing him, and well, this went on for years. Well, then one day, I moved and came out to California. Well, Dale missed me a lot, and Dale used to call up on the phone, usually fairly late at night, and we'd talk, you know, on the phone. But one night, phone rang late, and Dale's on, and Dale didn't sound right. This guy was usually, you know, very logical, articulate man. He wasn't being articulate. Yeah, Dale just wasn't himself. I couldn't figure out why, and I couldn't get it out of him, but he was apparently calling me, appealing for some aid, and I just couldn't figure out what aid to give him. All I knew is he just wasn't right, and I suggested that he just go ahead, go to bed, sleep it off, call me in the morning, you know. And I hung the phone up. I went to work the next morning, worked all day long, and then when I came home from work, I pulled up in the driveway. I looked up at the front door of our house, and the front door was wide open. And I went, oh no. two of us musicians lived in this home. We had a recording studio and a lot of expensive gear in there, and the door being wide open is not a good sign. And I'm thinking, oh God, we got robbed. So I jump out of the car, I start heading for the front door. I look on the front porch, and paper boy been throwing these advertiser papers on the front porch for weeks on end. I wasn't reading them, and every now and then I'd scrape them all up and toss them in the recycling bin. But I got to the front porch, I looked at the door, but then turned and looked at the papers. Every one of these moldy old newspapers was lined up in perfect lines, spaced, even perfect arrangement. And I went, what? Huh? That's too weird. Who the heck would straighten out my newspapers and then leave? So I came in the front door, panicked that the studio was robbed. I went through the whole house. I couldn't find anything that had been touched. It was perfect. But the front door was open, and you know, I grew up on the south side of Chicago in some pretty rough neighborhoods, and I never leave without jiggling a doorknob. It's just a habit from childhood. So I'm walking out a door, I rattle the knob and shake the door just to make sure that it locked, you know. And I know I'd done that. So how could the front door be open? So I'm baffled and confused, and I go over to my lazy boy in the den, and I go to flop down in the lazy boy. I'm gonna sit there and think this thing over, when all of a sudden I stare, and right in front of me, the back patio door is wide open. Oh no, too much. This is too much. No way did I leave two doors open. You know, and a side front door, if it had been unlocked, yeah, it could have swung open in a wind. Patio door slides to the side. Something pushed that door. So I said, somebody's been here. But then I looked down, and on the doormat just outside the patio door in my backyard are a pair of old combat boots that I used to wear in the garden. And because they were full of mud, I would always kick them off before coming inside the house. Well, the tops were old and worn out, and they'd always fold over, flop over like this when I pulled them off, because they were ancient boots, and they were usually laying on their sides with the tops all floppy and covered in mud. I looked down, and those combat boots were lined up perfectly on the mat. The tops stood straight up. Totally improbable. There's no way I took those boots off and they ended up looking like that. I know how they're supposed to look. They're supposed to be all over the place. Now I'm really confused. This is too weird. So I flop down on the lazy boy, and no sooner do I sit down and scratch my head twice, telephone rings. Well, it's Gladys Nabanash, Native American instructor, Native American Studies instructor from the same college Dale worked at, and we were all kind of mutual friends. She knew Dale very well. She was calling me to tell me that Dale had died the night before. Apparently what had happened, and this is why I couldn't understand what was going on with him, it was winter. He had the place closed up because it was cold out. He'd been laying linoleum with a contact adhesive. The fumes built up in the house, and basically he sniffed glue. You know, the whole house was filled with glue fumes, and he went out of his head from the stuff. Well, apparently, in the process, he killed himself with his hunting rifle while he was out of his mind on contact adhesive. And I'd been the last guy that he talked to. The police had determined by the phone records that I was the last man to talk to him while he was alive. I felt terrible, of course, that I hadn't realized, and there was nothing I could have done from where I was at. But she had also let me know that the police would be in contact with me to interview, you know, because of this. And so then, after the phone call, I sat back down in my chair, And it's like it just all came to me. I realized all those games, all those years of turning that pencil cockeyed, of turning the Marlboro sideways, of teasing Dale about his habits, and then constant debate over whether there is life after death or not, and Dale always saying, no, it can't be proved. The night he died, I believe, you don't have to, but I believe that his spirit came, straightened my newspapers out, straightened my boots up, and the reason that both doors were wide open was, to me, it was a signal from Dale as he passed that he was only passing through. He came in one door, he went out the other, and to wherever spirits go. I also had a very distinct feeling that he was not alone. That one is human intuition. I felt the presence that he was with somebody, and that he'd almost asked a favor or something, because it was, to me, it was him coming back to me in the very end and telling me, Bill, you were right. You were right. And the message that he left, straightening the papers, the boots, and all this was something that nobody else on earth except for Dale and I knew about. We never talked to even each other about it. Yet he knew all the time I was doing it to him, but it was never discussed. And here it was, He straightened all my stuff. He come in one door, left out the other. So I think that was the time when I crossed the line for good. And I said, okay, we got spirit. It exists. There's something we do after we die. And if the guy who didn't believe in this left me a message on it, it must be pretty important that I should continue to believe in what I believe, At least that's what I thought. So, rather than bore you with all of my long and bizarre stories about spooks and spirits, ghosts and goblins and souls, I guess I just have one question to the viewers out there today, and that is, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about spirit, soul, life after death? Do you have ideas, opinions? I'd love to hear them, really. I'm just curious, how many of us. I know there'll be plenty of you that have the classic stories, which we've been taught. And I've had those myself, and so I'm familiar with them. So there you have it. My story about my friend Dale. You can enjoy it. You can laugh at it. You can go ahead and tell me that I'm a deluded moron, whatever you choose. It won't change the way I feel about it, so, enjoy yourselves one way or another there. But it all does bring to mind, when I mentioned suicide yesterday, as to wonder if there isn't a recycle to the human, and that if there isn't a certain way that it works out right, and ways that maybe doesn't work out so well. I guess that's my question here, and the concerns I have about suicide and about taking your own life. In Dale's case, hard to say. Poor guy was out of his head when it happened. Definitely had extenuating circumstances to his death. It was an unusual situation at best. But I'm just curious. I'd like to know how everybody else feels about this out there. I may not be able to respond to the torrent of comments, or I may just get a ho-hum, Bill, go on to gardening, will you? Whatever. I run out of topics on gardening sometimes, and I like to think other things. Gardening is not the only thing that I think about. Proof positive. So, maybe tomorrow there'll be some more interesting lava news. In the meantime, you all have a wonderful day. Aloha, and oh yeah, don't forget to hang loose.